ለመማር ወደ ትምህርት ተቋም መሄድ ግድ አይደለም። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
ራሳችሁን ከኮሮና ቫይረስ ወረርሽኝ እየጠበቃችሁ በቤታችሁ ወይም በተመቻችሁ ቦታ በኢንተርኔት አማካኝነት በኦንላይን ትምህርታችሁን መከታተል ትችላላችሁ።
ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ኢንስቲትዩት ኦፍ ኮመርሻል ማኔጅመንት ICM ጋር በመተባበር የሚሰጡ ትምህርቶችን ተከታትላችሁ በ6 ወር ጊዜ በዓለም አቀፍ ደረጃ ተቀባይነት ያለውን የስልጠና ማስረጃ ባለቤት መሆን ይቻላል።
ልምድ ባላቸው መምህራን እየተማራችሁ ጥያቄና መልስ፣ የክፍል ስራዎች፣ ፈተና መፈተን ክፍል ውስጥ እንዳላችሁት አይነት በኦንላይን ባላችሁበት ቦታ ከናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ
የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ
Hello, good afternoon, dear students. I was reading some chat information. So before commencing our today teaching learning process, I think it's better to share you with the assignment and to give you some brief. So now let me first share the document. Now I can share it. In our previous session, we have started the 4th chapter, critical thinking. Under that session, we have covered 2 lessons. The first lesson was understanding the meaning of critical thinking, which is all about conceptualizing critical thinking, the meaning of critical thinking and some related concepts with critical thinking. And under the second lesson, we have seen the standards of critical thinking. Today, we'll cover the remaining 2 lessons. The first lesson of our today discussion is that the first one is all about the principles of good argument and the principles of critical thinking. After we have covered this part, we'll finally see the characteristics or the personal traits of critical thinkers, vice versa uncritical thinkers. So we will see, we'll cover these 2 lessons in our today session. As we have discussed in our previous sessions in chapter 2 and in the last session, we have said that an argument must contain a claim or evidences. Those evidences must be in order to say a passage in the argument, we have said there must be 2 things fulfilled. The first one is that we have seen it that there must be a claim, an evidence, the alleged evidence. And the second one is the inferential, the reasoning process. So in argument, these 2 are very important. In order to say that there is a good argument, first the passage must able to purport something. So that these 2 conditions must be fulfilled. At the same time, we have said that critical thinking is a kind of disciplined thinking. It's a disciplined thinking which encompasses or which has a kind of cognitive skill and dispositions. We have seen those cognitive skills and most cited disposition of critical thinking. Because these things will govern the critical in understanding of, for analyzing, for evaluating of the arguments. And also we have seen the standards, the basic intellectual standards of critical thinking, the 8 standards of critical thinking, which are very, very essential to understand, to evaluate, to analyze the arguments and evaluate that argument. Okay, first, let me share you a teaching video.
An argument is an attempt to persuade, but the goal of logic and argumentation isn't simply to persuade, it's to persuade for good reasons. The most basic definition of a good argument is straightforward. It's an argument that gives us good reasons to believe the conclusion. Now, there's not much we can do with this argument, though. It's too vague. We have to say more about what we mean by good reasons, obviously. To do this, we'll start by looking at some ways that arguments can fail to be good. And from these, we'll extract a couple of necessary conditions for an argument to be good. Here's an argument. All actors are robots. Tom Cruise is an actor. Therefore, Tom Cruise is a robot. Here's another argument. All tigers are mammals. Tony is a mammal. Therefore, Tony is a tiger. Both of these are bad arguments, as you might be able to see, but they're bad in different ways. In the first argument on top, the problem is obviously that the first premise is false. All actors are not robots. But that's the only problem with this argument. In particular, the logic of the argument is perfectly good. And when I say that the logic is good, what I mean is that the premises logically support or imply the conclusion, or that the conclusion follows from the premises. But in this case, it's clear that, if the premises of this argument were all true, then the conclusion would have to be true, right? If all actors were robots, and if Tom Cruise is an actor, then it would follow that Tom Cruise would have to be a robot. The conclusion does follow from these premises. Now, let's look at the other argument. All tigers are mammals. Tony is a mammal. Therefore, Tony is a tiger. First question, are all the premises true? Are all tigers mammals? Yes, they are. Is Tony a mammal? Well, in this case, we have no reason to question the premise, so we can stipulate that it's true. So in this argument, all the premises are true. Now what about the logic? This is where we have a problem. Just because all tigers are mammals, and just because Tony is a mammal, it doesn't follow that Tony has to be a tiger, right? Tony could be a dog, or a cat, or a mouse. So even if we grant that all the premises are true, these premises don't give us any good reason to accept that conclusion. So this argument has the opposite problem of the first argument. The first argument has good logic, but a false premise.
Okay, as you can easily understand from the video, in the first example, is a logically sound argument. In the case of the second example, it's logically bad argument. In the case of the first argument, the problem is there is a false premises. No matter how the reasoning process or the logic is correct, the first premise, the first support that we have, or the first evidence was false. So the first premises is false. All actors are robots. Is a false premises. So the problem here is that the problem of the false premises. So in order to say an argument is good, there must, the two conditions must be exist at the same time. That is, having, according to this video, true premises and good logic. The first example lacks a true claim or a true premises. In the case of the second, it lacks logical reasoning. But all are arguments, but not good arguments. Let me invite the remaining part.
This argument has all true premises, but bad logic. They're both bad arguments, but they're bad in different ways. And these two distinct ways of being bad give us a pair of conditions that an argument must satisfy if it's going to be good. First condition: if an argument is good, then all the premises must be true. We'll call this the truth condition. Second, if an argument is good, then the conclusion must follow from the premises. We'll call this the logic condition. Note that at the top I call these necessary conditions. What this means is that any good argument has to satisfy these conditions. If an argument is good, then it satisfies both the truth condition and the logic condition. But I'm not saying that they're sufficient conditions. And by that I mean that they don't by themselves guarantee that an argument is going to be good. An argument can satisfy both conditions but still fail to be good for other reasons. Still, these are the two most important conditions to be thinking about when you're doing argument analysis. In later tutorials, we'll look more closely at both the truth condition and the logic condition, and we'll also look at ways in which an argument can satisfy both conditions.
As you have seen it, the truth condition and the logic conditions are necessary, but they are not sufficient conditions. They are not sufficient conditions in order to say that the existence of or the presence of this necessary condition is not sufficient in order to say that an argument is good. These are the most necessary conditions that an argument must has as a necessary condition, but they are not sufficient condition. So you can understand that the truth condition and logical reasoning are the most important necessary condition in order to say that an argument is good, but they are not sufficient. As you can see from the screen, codes of intellectual conduct for effective discussion. It says codes of intellectual conduct for effective. These are important code of conducts which are recommended for an intellectual to apply while in a discussion. So in order to make our discussion very effective and purposeful as intellectual, we must understand and apply this code of intellectuals, code of conduct. These are code of conduct as an intellectual that you need to apply or use to make our discussion is better off and very effective and purposeful. So these are very so principles of good argument and principles of critical thinking are the codes of conduct for intellectuals. Both the principles of good argument and principles of critical thinking. We look at these principles. So discussing may involve two or more participants in every discussion. We may have a discussion with another individual. At the same time, we may have a discussion with those having more participants. And sometimes we may have a discussion with, we may consult with ourselves, a discussion with ourselves. So these intellectual code of conducts are important for any types of discussion, either with a discussion with another single individual or discussion with ourselves and a discussion with more participants. So this intellectual code of conduct, or sometimes we call them as an intellectual styles, have their role in constructing our argument to be strong for ourselves and for others, and to resolve a kind of difference or conflict concerning the issue being discussed. So that the application of these styles of intellectual or the course of conduct help us to make a strong argument and to resolve conflicts in any discussion. So these are the 5 basic style of intellectuals or code of conduct for good argument. Let us look at the first principles of good argument. To make, as I have told you, to make our discussion effective and purposeful, we must look at the structures of our arguments. Because the structure of the argument has its role in transferring our purpose, so that it must be structurally sound first, which means an argument requires, unfortunately, you may in favor of a discussion, a specific topic, at the same time you may also be against that position. So you can opt, you may in favor, or you may for, or you may against a position in a certain discussion. It's not problematic whether you are against or a position or you are for the issue being discussed. But the important thing here is that in an argument, you must consider the requirement of fundamental structural requirements. It must be well formulated. The arguments that we are against a position or for a position must be well formed, which means it must be structurally sound. We have seen what makes an argument is sound. So that in structural principles, our claim should not be contradict one another. The premise, we may have more than 2 premises in a single argument. We may have 2. At the same time, we may have a single premises. So the relationship between the premise and the conclusion should not be contradict one another or each other. They must be supplementary, or they must be complementary. If they are contradict each other, or if the premise is not support the conclusion, which means if there is a contradiction between the evidences from the very beginning, that argument is not structurally sound, so that we cannot form a kind of good argument. So as one criteria or principles of good argument, our reasons, our evidences must be complementary. They should not be contradict one another. And they must be constructed like an argument, because we have said that what an argument is. So an argument must look and work like an argument in order to make it structurally sound. So a good argument should also provide us with reason to believe that the conclusion deserves our acceptance. If those reasons does not let us, or if those reason does not give a clue to accept the conclusion, or if the premises, the alleged evidences does not give reason or to accept the conclusion, that argument is not good, and that is structurally is not sound, so that it's failed to consider that argument as good argument. So that the argument must be acceptance, has got an acceptance through the alleged evidence, Another structural feature of an argument that could render is fatally flawed would be one whose premises are incompatible with the other. For example, if you assume there are 3 premises, the first premises should not be incompatible with the remaining 2 premises. There must be compatibility. If it failed, if the premises are not compatible, if they are not reinforcing each other, that is, it fails the structural failure of a good argument. So a conclusion that contradicts another claim in the same argument violates the law of non-contradiction. So in every argument, there is the law of non-contradiction, or the principle of non-contradiction. Some claims should not violate the other claims. The premise should not violate the conclusion that deserves our acceptance. Because the very essence of constructing an argument is to persuade or to let others to accept our judgments and our logic. So that if there is contradiction among our premises, how it could be possible to convince others to accept our argument? Totally impossible. So the premises, the conclusions, these 2 parties should go hand in hand. They should not be contradict each other. One should not present in a positive way, and the other should not be in a negative way. So the law of non-contradiction must be exist in the principles of structure. This is the first. This is the first principle. The second principle is that the relevance principle. We have seen this in the standards of critical thinking, relevance principles. And I think you have a good understanding of what relevance means. We have said relevance is all about the relatedness and the connection. So that we have said that we should not waste our time by searching all sources of knowledge related with the issue being under discussion. We must opt those relevant, basic, related information about the issue being discussed. Because those relevant evidences will help, and it will and the discussion process very effective. As an intellectual, you should not collect ample and bulky information. It is a lot. In one hand, collection of many evidences about a specific issue may become as a lot, not as an opportunity. So that relevance principle should apply in an argument in order to say it is good argument. And it is refers to that an argument, as I have told you, it may be against a position, or it may be for or in favor of an argument. So should set forth only reason. Truth provides some evidences for the truth of the conclusion. So the evidences, there is some evidences for the truth that provide evidence for the conclusion. These are the premises that provide the conclusion must only be relevant or related, or issue that is directly connected with. There is no reason to waste time in assessing the truth or the acceptability of the premise if it is not even relevant to the truth of the conclusion. No matter how we have a kind of true information, no matter how it is true information, if it is out of the motion, out of the issue that is being discussed, and if it's out of the topic, it has any significance. It does not give us any advantage. Only those information, those evidences are important if they are related with the issue being discussed. So we must search evidences, we must provide evidences in a discussion as an intellectual which are related with the issue. If we are stand here and go there without any coherence, without any team, it will never add something, only wasting time. So the premise is relevant if it accepts, provides some reason to the belief, or counts in favor of or has bearing on the truth or the merit of the conclusion. So the evidence is important if it brings or if it has some bearing on the truth or the merit of the conclusion. So a premise is irrelevant if its acceptance has no bearing on the provide or the evidence for, or has no connection to the truth or the merit of the conclusion. It is irrelevant no matter how the fact is true. If it has no bearing, or if it cannot add something important on the discussion or on the argument, so it must be relevant. The third principles of good argument is the acceptability principle. I think you remember the 3 parts of critical thinking. Raising questions. The first was the reading. I mean, the first parts of the that one is asking relevant questions as a critical thinker, then searching, trying to answer those questions, and the third one is acceptance of the answer, no matter the result is, whether it's in favor of us or against us. Acceptability. We must accept the outcome of the argument if the premises support the conclusion in allegedly. So that this principle requires one who presents an argument for or against a position should provide reasons that are likely to be accepted by mature rational person in the meet standard criteria of acceptability. So the reason set forth or the reason provided most likely to be accepted by the matured person or a rational person. The reason set forth in support of the conclusion must be acceptable. What makes the conclusion acceptable is that the reasons that we have. If our reasons are very fragile and cannot well support the conclusion in the minds of the other in any discussion, it will not be acceptable for others. So that in order to others accept our argument, first make the premises acceptable. The premises. First, forget the conclusion. First, make the premises acceptable by our counterparties. After we become sure of our premises are acceptable, then most likely our counterpart can accept the conclusion if it is depends on the reason set forth in the premises. So that make our premises acceptable in the mind and the eyes of our counterparts or in any discussion, will make our conclusion to be acceptable. The reason is acceptable if it is a kind of claim that rational person would accept in the face of all relevant evidence available. So evidence, relevant available evidences are very crucial to make it our argument acceptable. So some people believe that the acceptable principle should be replaced by truth principle to connect that the idea that principle should not be true to be acceptable. So some people say that we can use interchangeably the principle of acceptability and truth principle, but others will not accept. We should not use them interchangeably because of different reasons. For example, in some arguments, an arguer may use fallacy or defects. For example, in a situation where the arguer or the listener cannot prove or disprove the argument, at that time, the only chance that we have is only accepting the argument if we cannot disprove or approve it. At that time, we don't know. We may not able to know the truth values of the argument, but we may simply accept it because of the evidences which are only exist. This we call it a fallacy of argument based on ignorance. If our counterpart or our listener is ignorant of an issue being discussed, we may pursue we may let him to accept our argument because he is ignorant about that. He cannot prove or disprove our argument. So that by default, he accepts our arguments. At that time, we cannot discuss about the principle of truth or the truth condition. Because of this and other reasons, some individuals, some writers say that we should not use interchangeably the principles of acceptability and truth principle as if they are similar. But simply acceptability principle refers to make it our premises acceptable on the eyes of others to accept our conclusion. What makes it acceptable is that the relevant evidence. Of course, all principles are reinforcing each other. They are part and the parcel of the other. The fourth principles of good argument is the sufficiency. The principles of sufficiency. You have seen the two necessary conditions of good argument. That is the true condition and the principles of logic condition. And under that, we have said that these two are not sufficient. They are necessary. Under sufficient principle, an arguer should attempt to provide relevant and acceptable reason of the right kind. It's not only what makes an argument good because of it is relevant, but also it must be also acceptable. Altogether, the combination or the sum total of these principles make an argument sufficient. So there must be relevant and there must be acceptability. Together are sufficient in number and weight justifies the acceptance of the conclusion. So according to this principle, the existence of only what relevance is not enough. So it must be also acceptable. The feature of sufficient principle is that most difficult to apply is the assignment of the weight of each piece of supporting evidence. This is a very tricky question. Understanding the value or the weight of the supporting evidence, able to identify which evidences weight more. It's very difficult task, weighting the evidences value. So disagreement over the issue probably cause most of the problem in informal discussion. Because of this, some evidences are very may given high weight by others. The remaining supporting evidences may be given by high weight by others, so that there exist different ways of assignment of the piece of evidence, the supporting evidence. So that as a result of this weighting of the value of the supporting evidence, there might be disagreement. So the disagreement may arise because of the assignment of the weight. What one participant regards as the most important piece of advice by another may regard as trivial, very trace and very minor by comparison with the other possible evidences. So giving the chance to look and examine those supporting evidences equally. giving the chance. So one should ask several questions when applying sufficiency test of a particular argument. We may raise different questions which will help us in testing the weight of the supporting evidence. For example, we may raise questions related with its relevancy. We may raise questions related with its acceptance, its truth value. So by raising those questions, we may test the weights of the supporting evidence. If we do that, the disagreement on a discussion will be resolved and it will become very effective as an intellectual. So when you encounter such problem, what you have to do as an intellectual is that asking or raising several questions. Then it will become clear. The principles of sufficiency. The fifth principle is a rebuttal principle. This principle requires that there should be the arguments in order to be effective rebuttal, all anticipated stress criticism of the arguments that may be brought against the position it supports. As an arguer in every discussion, we must be able to forecast or anticipate the possible stress criticism against our arguments. We must forecast, and we must make it open for criticism, not for critics by making it personalized criticism, the constructive criticism of the idea, not the person. So since the argument is usually presented against the background that there is another side of the issue, a good argument must meet the other side directly. An argument cannot be a good one if it does not.
በትምህርት ከፍ ብሎ መብረር ይቻላል። ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ከከፍተኛ ትምህርት አግባብነትና ጥራት ኤጀንሲ ሙሉ ዕውቅናን ባገኘንባቸው በማስተርስ ዲግሪ ኤምቢኤ በስትራቴጂክ ማኔጅመንት፣ ኤምቢኤ በባንኪንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ ኤምቢኤ በቢዝነስ ሊደርሺፕ፣ ኤምቢኤ በሪስክና ኢንሹራንስ፣ ኤምኤስሲ በኢንተርናሽናል ትሬድ እና ኢኮኖሚክስ ዘርፎች በእውቀት ለመቅረጽ የበቁ ፕሮፌሰሮቻችን አረንጓዴ መብራታቸውን አብርተዋል። በነገራችን ላይ በኬንያ ሀገር ከሚገኙ ስመጥር ዩኒቨርሲቲዎች በሚመጡ ፕሮፌሰሮች የትኩረት መስክ ትምህርቶቹ መሰጠታቸው ልዩ ያደርገናል። በምርጥ የትምህርት ስርዓት የተገነባው ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ በመጀመሪያ ዲግሪ በአቪዬሽን ማኔጅመንት፣ በሆቴል ማኔጅመንት፣ በአካውንቲንግ እና ፋይናንስ፣ በማርኬቲንግ ማኔጅመንት አስተማማኝ ትምህርት ይገቢውና ራስዎንና ሀገሮን ይለውጡ። አድራሻ 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።
Does not anticipate and effectively refute or blueprint the force of the most stress criticism against them. The position that it supports. We should not only reject those comments because of we have a personal problem with those individuals. There are very, very constructive stress criticism on our position or on our argument. So we must make it open for criticism. So a complete argument might have refuted the argument mastered on behalf of the alternate position on the issue in question, so that while we are appearing or while we are arguing, we must provide the most advantage or well-studied or the well-mastered parts of the argument, so that it will become acceptable, because we have included the different alternatives which are suggested on the criticism, other criticism I mean. So we have seen the 5 basic principles of good argument. Now let us see the principles of critical thinking. The principles of, as I have told you, they are reinforcing each other. The principles of good argument and the principle of critical thinking are reinforcing each other. And as an intellectual, we must apply these principles to make our discussion is better off and very effective. So now let's look at the codes of intellectual conduct in the case of critical thinking. We have around 7 or 8 principles: the resolution principle, suspension of judgment principle, the principle of charity, the principle of burden of proof, the clarity principle. You have a preliminary understanding of this principle. The truth-seeking principle, of course, you have the understanding of this principle, and the fallibility principle. So let's start by looking at the fallibility principle. In this principle, as an arguer, we must acknowledge and understand that our initial view or our perspective may not be the most defensible position on a certain question or in a certain discussion, if that's a response. So we must first understand that our perspective, our view may not be acceptable and may not be the right one. We may make false statements. As a result, we may construct a false argument. So first, we must acknowledge that our understanding, our perspective may be wrong, may be false. We must accept first this one. So to employ the fallibility principle in every discussion, conscientiously to accept the fact that you are fallible. You have to understand this one. We are fallible. We cannot be escaped from making or committing mistakes. We are fallible. We made mistakes. We make faults. But we must acknowledge that we are fallible. That your present view may be wrong or not most defensible view of the matter in dispute. So that if you first understand that your view is fallible, you must hear, you must listen the arguments of others and the viewpoint of others. After we have give attention for the view and the views of and the perspectives of others, if there is a possibility or if we must change our mind in a certain issue, that is a better one. We must change our mind if we are wrong. So you are in effect saying that you are not willing to change your mind, even if you are hearing better arguments. So that if we are not first assume that we are fallible, we should not even enter in discussion, because the discussion cannot be effective if we do not want to listen the arguments and the perspectives of the other, why we enter into discussion? The reason that we need to enter into discussion is that if there is a problem or if there is something constructive in the argument of others, when you compare with others, it is to shift our mind. But if I say that I am not fallible, it simply tell us you not even change your mindset up, even if our counterparties give us very plausible and sounding arguments on that particular discussion, or they should be discussed. So we must first acknowledge that we are fallible. It is pretty strong evidence that you do not intend to play fairly, and there is no real point to continue the discussion. If you don't want to accept the viewpoint of others, the others should not waste their time. What's the reason to continue the discussion? If you do not entertain fairly the argument of others, so you should have this kind of mind setup. I am fallible. Say that I'm fallible. So an admission of fallibility, if you accept your fallibility, is positive sign that you are genuinely interested in the kinds of honesty required that may lead to a fair resolution of the issue. This is the first principle, fallibility principles. So as an intellectual, you must accept, you must entertain the viewpoints of the other. Then if there is misunderstanding on the side of you, you should shift your mind setup and argue accordingly with the counterparties. The second one is the truth-seeking principle. It's very clear and self-explanatory. Truth-seeking. You must be a truth seeker, not a legend seeker, or a tradition or a hearsay seeker. You must be truth seeker, appreciating truth, admiring truth, accepting truth. Accepting truth. So this principle, as the principles of critical thinkers, you should willing to examine alternatives, positions, reasoning, look for insights in a position of others, allow others participate to present argument for rights, objection, or to any position held on the issue. The more we examine different alternatives, the more we will get the chance to know the truth. And you should look at things by being in the position of others. Ask yourself, if I am in the position of other, did I accept that argument? So be in the footsteps of others in order to scrutinize or look at the truth, the truthfulness of the evidence. And you should invite others to raise their objections, if any, and to make things very clear. If they raise questions and objections, and if we agreed on those, then after it is easy to accept the conclusion, because they raise questions, they raise objection, any position. So that we look at different alternatives, we will provide evidences and will reconcile and will decide accordingly. So that it is very important to seek all alternative as much as possible, but it's difficult to search all alternative position in any issue. But at least we must invest to look at alternative in different direction, so that this will give us the chance to look or to see the truth. If we really are interested in finding the truth, really, you see, very powerful expression. If we really are interested in finding the truth, it is imperative not only that we assume that we may not know how have the truth, but that we listen to the argument of the alternative position and encourage criticism of our own arguments. If we have a kind of genuine argument, evidence, we cannot afraid any criticism at all, by any means. You know why some people become very arrogant and very powerful, why they are trying to persuade, why they are inculcating to accept their argument, is because of they lack all relevant alternatives, and it lacks even truth when we look at in detail. So truth-seeking principle is the second principle of critical thinking. The third one is the principle of clarity. I think is very clear. Any successful discussion of an issue must be carried on a language that all parties involved can understand. So do not use jargon words that lead others to enter into confusion. Confusion is some individuals, I don't know why, they use very powerful words. Powerful here refers to using words that they assume the other will not understand that word. That's a kind of silly and foolish mistake. The very purpose of communication is for understanding. If we want to understand each other, we must present in a language that is understandable by others. Simply use very simple and clear language to mitigate or to minimize that lack of clarity. Even if what we have to say in a perfectly to ourselves, others may not be able to understand us. So don't forget that no matter how it is clear for us, others may not be clear, because we have different way of understanding of things. So in order to make it, use very simple language, avoid ambiguity and confusion. This is the principle of clarity. The fourth principle is the burden of proof principles. And this principle, in some argument, the arguer or the claimant itself may have the burden of proving the argument by referring the evidences. In some arguments, the claimant may not be enter into burden to brief or to prove that argument. For example, when there are very general issues, acceptable issues, you are not entered into the burden of proof to prove its acceptability. Or in case where is ignorance, or if there is lack of evidence, but still you are not in the burden of proof. But to make our argument acceptable, the arguer must prove its acceptability. So when an opponent asks about that argument, the claimant, or that is the proponent, should prove it. He has the burden of proof it. I must prove that argument. Just as a person is generally held accountable for his or his own action, one who makes a positive or negative claim about something that has, we call it the burden of proof. You know that in our everyday to-day action, we are responsible what we have committed. For example, if we commit a crime, if we made a bribe, corruption, we're accountable for that. The same point in logic, for our arguments, we're responsible and accountable to make it clear and acceptable by proving our argument for others. So the burden of proof here lies on the claimant, or the one who is in favor of that argument. But as I have told you, there are exceptions that you are not supposed to prove every argument in case where is common rules or well-established or uncontroversial issues. Okay, the fourth principles of critical thinking. The fifth one is the principle of charity. This principle refers to we should be careful expressing in a strong possible version. You see? Okay, I'm looking at who is raising their hands. Okay. Any problem? Please.
Sorry, it was a mistake. I'm sorry.
Okay, the raising hand was mistakenly raised. Okay, so we can continue. No problem. So we should present or express carefully in its strongest possible version that is consistent with what is believed to be original intention of the arguer. If there is misunderstanding, if any, if there is any question about the intention or about of any implicit doubts in the argument, the arguer should give the benefit of any doubt in the reformulation. We should reformulate again if there is any mistake, which is in contrary with our previous or original intention as an arguer. So we should reformulate in line with our original intention as an arguer. So a good discussion in general and an argumentation in particular impose an ethical requirement on the participants. There must be ethics. Even if the participants in the discussion lacks ethics, it's very difficult even to conduct the discussion itself. So the participants need to abide by the ethical considerations. The sixth one is the suspension of judgment principles. Here refers to, in some arguments, there might be 50-50 possibility. It may not, or it may be at the same time. So if there is a strongest defense from our arguers, that is our counter arguers, we should accept this as normal, and we should also give equal weight for those points. So we should suspend or we should stop making judgment on that issue. We must accept that as if that is equally important until other supporting evidences are discovered on that issue. Sometimes we may close our discussion by accepting two views equally, because the pros and the cons may be equal. The known and the unknown may be equal. So that we should refrain from making judgment on that occasion. So this principle, a principle of critical thinker, we should not take a position that is our counter argument can defend by good argument like us, so that two or more positions to be defended with equal strength, equal weight. There might be the chance. So one should, in most cases, suspend judgment about the issue. If practical considerations seem to require more immediate decision, one should weigh the relative benefit or harm connected with the consequence of the suspending judgment. Here refers to if the suspension of judgment because of equal weight of the evidences, if it demands an immediate attention and decision, even though we have equal evidences, we should look at the current existing working circumstances or the potential relative benefits and it is demerit, so that we may opt one, though we know that that's equally important. In some occasions or in some circumstances, we may obliged or forced to make decision. So that we must look at the relative benefit or harms related with the remedies or the repercussion of that suspension of judgment and deciding accordingly based on the existing grounds. So if suitable evidence is so lacking, this refers to wouldn't have those relevant and suitable evidences to make a decision, we may quite appropriate suspend the judgment on the matter and wait until there is more or a base for decision. If the situation does not demand a swift solution or decision, we must as a principle suspend our judgments. But if it demands urgent decision and solution, we must decide by weighting the benefits and it is demerits. The final, I think, is the resolution principle. This principle refers to that in every argument, one of the alternate position is structurally sound. On that, use relevant and acceptable, that is, together provide sufficient ground to justify the conclusion and also include the effective rebuttal to all trace criticism of the argument. So unless one can demonstrate that the argument has not met this condition more successfully than any argument presented for the alternate position. So one is obliged to accept its conclusion and consider the issue to be settled. Resolution. We must use the most efforts that we have to settle the difference by looking at those remaining or the above listed principles of critical thinking. Now let's look at the final parts of discussion in this session. that is the characteristics or the personal traits of critical thinkers and uncritical thinkers. The very essence of this part is to make learners critical thinkers, unlike uncritical thinkers. So I consider, or I suppose you will become a critical thinker, so that you must have these traits as a critical thinker. As a learner, to become a critical thinker, you must accompany by these personal characteristics or traits. So those who are a critical thinker simply the person who examines some feature of critical thinking. Is nothing. Critical thinker refers to a person who fulfills or exhibits or who has those listed features of critical thinking. So a person who has this attribute is considered as a critical thinker. There are some disposition and attitude, skills, abilities, habits, and values that every critical person should manifest. Among those intellectual traits of critical thinker, let's look at some. Critical thinkers are honest with themselves. They are honest even for themselves. They don't want to pretend and cheat themselves. They are honest with them. There are individuals who are not even, who cannot reconcile with themselves. They interconflict with themselves. They are not honest with themselves. They try to pretend false things as if they're true, which will become a habit and which finally will eliminate a person at all. So they are honest with themselves. Critical thinkers are honest. They don't pretend, they don't cheat themselves. They acknowledge what they do not know. They know that human beings cannot know everything. They acknowledge, they know, they understand that there are issues that they may know, they may not know. Simply, they understand that they are fallible and there are issues which are not known by themselves. So that they acknowledge that there are issues which are out of their horizon and they know that they do not know it. Some individuals try to become as if they know everything. If you ask something, if you ask some kinds of clue or some kinds of evidence or information about a particular issue, they simply accept the invitation, even though they do not know substantially, but they feel that they know everything. They know everything. But critical thinkers know that or acknowledges they do not know everything. So that they know their limitation, their drawback, their pitfall. They know their weakness. They know that they have their own weakness. And being watchful for their own errors. This gives the chance to them to look at their own errors. If they accept they are fallible, if they know that they don't know everything, and if they are honest for themselves, simply they are watchful their own errors. They can look at their mistakes. And critical thinkers regard problems and controversial issues as existing challenges. Remember, problems sometimes give us an opportunity. For example, the existing pandemic, COVID-19, has its own opportunity. Though it is very stress disease, even for in our country context. So as a critical thinker, what you need to bear in mind is that every problem should not only bring us challenges. There are also opportunities within problems. For example, this online teaching, learning through Zoom conference is one opportunity. As a critical thinkers, you must acknowledge and accept and appreciate challenges. So critical thinkers assume challenges not as a defeatist and as threats, but they also, or they can understand their opportunities if it is properly managed. So they regard problems, controversial issues, even in a discussion. If there is controversy, if there is over debate, we should not condemn it. We should appreciate, because it may give us the chance to look at things in detail. We may simply accept if there is no controversial issue in every discussion, but later we may raise our disagreements, our dissents on that issue. So first, it is better to accept challenges in every discussion as opportunities, as a critical thinkers. Critical thinkers strive for understanding, keep curiosity alive, remain patient when there is a complexity, even complexity. They remain patient. They are ready to invest time to overcome confusion. If there is any confusion, rather than they become anxious and becoming very arrogant, they invest time to clear that confusion or to overcome that confusion. Critical thinker base their judgment on evidence rather than personal feeling. Preferences, differing judgments. You see? So the judgment of the critical thinkers is based on evidence, is not based on their personal gut feeling, not because of their personal attitude. They make judgment in line with the existing evidences. So they minimize the chance of subjectivity in judgment. Whenever the evidence is insufficient, even if there is a chance of error in judgment, when there is new evidences, they try to reveal that and make decision accordingly by correcting that mistake. Critical thinkers are interested in other people's idea. They are very ambitious and interested to listen to your voice and your ideas. So they are willing to read and listen alternatively, even when they tend to disagree with the other person. Even though there is, even within the disagreement, they wanted to listen those disagreements. They recognize that extreme views, outliers views, whether it might be a very conservative or very liberal. They see seldomly correct us, so they avoid them and practice fair minds and seek to a balanced view. So even it might be very conservative, it might be liberal, it may be a very healthful view. They recognize the existence of very outlier views, extreme views. There are views which are not similar with the average person. There are deviant views, deviant expressions. These critical thinkers acknowledge and recognize these extreme views. They look and practice fair-mindedly, and they seek a balanced view. And they also practice restraints, controlling their feeling rather than being controlled them, thinking before acting. These are person who has these traits or these characteristics. Unlike those critical thinkers, uncritical thinkers has this basic treatise. They're the direct opposite of critical thinkers. If you understand the treatise and the characteristics of the critical thinkers, the treatise of the uncritical thinkers is the direct opposite of that one. So, you can easily understand. They pretend they know more than they do. They pretend, they cheat themselves, and they are not honest for themselves. They ignore, they feel they are not fallible. They feel they are not fallible, so they don't want to accept their mistake and their limitation and assume their view are error-free. Regard problems and controversial issues as a threat to their ego, not as an opportunity, and are impatient with the complexity and thus would rather remain confused than make effort to find. They don't want to make effort to invest on that complexity, and because they become impatient and base judgment on the first impression. The critical thinkers base their judgment on the evidences, but in the case of uncritical thinkers, what they make a basis that the impatient and gut reactions. They are unconcerned about the amount or the quality of the evidence and cling to their views steadfastly. They are preoccupied with themselves, their own opinion, and so they are unwilling to pay attention to the views of others. They don't want to give attention to the views of others. At the first sign of the disagreement, they think, how can I refute that? Ignore the need for a balance and give preference to views that support their established views and tend to follow their feeling and act impulsively. These are our today's basic concepts. If you have questions, please, you're welcome. You can raise your hands. If you have a question, you can raise your hands.
ልዩነት መፍጠር ዓላማችን ነው። ዓለም አቀፍ ተወዳዳሪ መሆን አለባችሁ። የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ጥራትና ደረጃውን የጠበቀ ስልጠና በመስጠት ብቁ ዜጋ እያፈራን ነው። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ፣ በቲኬቲንግና ሪዘርቬሽን፣ በሆቴልና ቱሪዝም ሙያዎች አሰልጥነን ተወዳዳሪ እናደርጎታለን። ኮሌጃችን ካናዳ ከሚገኘው ኢንተርናሽናል ኤር ትራንስፖርት አሶሲዬሽን አያታና ከእንግሊዙ ICM ጋር በመተባበር ዓለም አቀፍ ዕውቅና ያለው ስልጠና እየሰጠ ይገኛል። በፍላይት ኦፕሬሽን፣ በበረራ መስተንግዶ የምንሰጣቸው ስልጠና ከኢትዮጵያ ሲቪል አቪዬሽን ባለስልጣን ሙሉ ዕውቅና አለው። አድራሻ ከጎላጉል ታወር 22 አደባባይ ወደ ሾላ በሚወስደው መንገድ ላይ የናሽናል ኤርዌይስ እህት ኩባንያ ናሽናል አቪዬሽን ኮሌጅ ህልሞን እውን ያደርጋል።